There's a massive problem with Chainsaw Man Part 2 that causes it to be a significantly lesser version of the first part. Let me make it clear though, I still love and enjoy Chainsaw Man. I still enjoy reading Part 2. However, there's a glaring issue with it that I just wanted to discuss today. It is more or less the same thing as Part 1 while feeling hollow. Let's lay out what we know though, so we can really dive deep into this. What was the plot point that Part 1 revolved around in Chainsaw Man? Denji defending himself against those that want to take his heart or kill him, but there are several other plot points revolving around that, like Denji trying to find out who he is, the growing relationship between Aki, Denji, and Power, the mystery of Makima, capturing the Gun Devil, and several more. All of which are handled extremely well and within a short period of time are given enough light to shine. In contrast, we have Part 2's main plot line, which is to kill Chainsaw Man. With just the first main plot line, we are already retreading over previously crossed ground. We follow Asa on her journey to try to figure out who she is and to get her body back. That first point is also similar to the first part, the difference here being that Denji was a much more enjoyable character to follow. He may have had a crappy life, but he was still joyful and found peace in the simple things. Asa, on the other hand, is rather bratty, often upset or complaining because things don't go her way. Don't get me wrong though, I see this as an obviously set up conflict with Denji, who we have come to know and love, but it doesn't make her character more enjoyable to follow just knowing that. We also have that mystery of Fami and Yoshida currently going on in the relationship between Denji and Asa. For me personally though, their relationship has absolutely nothing on the one set up between Aki, Denji, and Power. Even that, though, may follow a similar structure, from unwillful participants in a relationship to best friends or maybe more. It does, however, have the twist of Yoru wanting to kill Chainsaw Man, which could prove interesting. So, don't get me wrong, it most definitely can get better. I fully expect it to. At the moment, though, it just isn't living up to the hype. That's coming from a diehard Chainsaw Man fan. To better present my case, let's look at what the first part had done in the same amount of chapters. Chainsaw Man Part 2 started at chapter 98 and is currently on chapter 122. That's 24 chapters. Now, let's look at where we were at 24 chapters into Part 1. At this point in Part 1, we are a good ways into the story. A lot, and I mean a lot of very important things have happened outside of setup, with us now being into the Katana Man arc. We begin to question Makima in this arc, we get some significant character deaths, and we start going a bit more in-depth with the actual plot. We have our introduction to Aki, Denji, and Power. We're well into building their relationships. We are getting to know how Makima operates. We've even started some relationship building outside of the main cast. This is exactly why a side character like Himeno dying is such a painful moment. Let's look on the other side at Part 2 though. We have our introduction to Asa, Yoru, Yuko, the Justice Devil, Fami, and a reintroduction to Yoshida. We haven't seen any functional relationships grow though. Asa has yet to make any real connections with anyone, not even the literal entity inside of her head. It feels like a one-man show. The only real relationship you could consider would be Denji, but she was pushing him away, with Nayuta eventually pushing that even further and sealing the deal. The main plot line of Asa killing Chainsaw Man hasn't really progressed either, and that's solely due to a side plot in which Yoshida is trying to keep Denji's mouth shut on his identity. The only real progression at this point is one similar to that of Part 1, Makima and Yoshida. At this point, we are starting to question his motives, just like we did with Makima. They are both characters who, while having a lot of screen time, mainly perform in the background. Chainsaw Man Part 2 just feels stagnant in comparison. There's a lot happening, but none of it is amounting to anything at this current point in time. This is also one of the reasons that I'm enjoying it though. There's a lot of build-up, and I feel as though the payoff will be significant. It's just that, while in the process, it feels lesser. Especially when comparing it to Part 1. I've seen lots of people losing interest in Part 2. I've seen lots of people saying that they would have been fine with, or think Chainsaw Man should have ended at Part 1. I get that feeling, but I don't necessarily agree. Fujimoto set up a lot of world building in Part 1 that I would love for to be expanded on, such as the primal fears, the horsemen, the true nature of Chainsaw Man, and just how the human world works with the existence of devils. Chainsaw Man Part 1 set up a massive world where just about anything could happen, and There's so much to explore. That's what keeps me excited for each new chapter, and what keeps me wanting to read it. Although, therein lies another issue. The world building in part 1 versus the world building in part 2. So much was built up within the story in part 1 that it'd be hard to expand on that going into part 2. With how stagnant things are feeling though, that would be seriously helpful in the quieter moments. Don't get me wrong on that either though. There are definitely moments where world building does occur in part 2, specifically on how devils affect normal people, especially kids. And that's amazing, but I don't think it's enough. Then we have character development, which I briefly mentioned earlier. While we had a full cast to flesh out in part 1, part 2 seems to lack that. There isn't much of a supporting cast to Asa besides Yoru. If anything, Denji is still the one with most of the supporting cast. I do, however, think this is intentional, and I'll get back to that in a second. In part 2, both Asa and Denji are main characters. I'd go as far as saying Yoshida is a main character as well, since we do see things from his point of view multiple times. Denji, however, has Yoshida and Nayuta as supporting characters, while Asa really just has Yoru. Yuko was one, but we know what happened there, and I don't think we can really consider Fami as a supporting character for Asa at this moment. Those new characters introduced in part 2 haven't gotten much in the way of development though. Even Asa as the main character is still pretty close to what she was when part 2 began. Back on the topic of it being intentional though, I mentioned there being a conflict between these two characters, and I think this is a part of that. Denji was someone who had nothing and then gained some semblance of a normal life. Asa, who we know had a family and a normal childhood, had in this scenario everything and lost it all. Everything presented so far has been identifying Asa as a conflicting character to everything that we know about Denji. Which makes sense why the story itself would be taking an opposite position in storytelling. That does not make it better in the process though. I can also see this being a comparison issue. Seeing Chainsaw Man Part 1 and Part 2 as separate entities brings unnecessary comparison that can cause these issues. But it's only human. I have high expectations for Part 2, and I hope I'm not let down. Things do seem to be ramping up here lately, but we need some payoff pretty soon before we lose more people from the series. It doesn't have to be everything at once, just something, even something small. With the introduction of this new devil, I think we'll get that, but until then, I'll have to hold my tongue. How are you feeling about Chainsaw Man Part 2 though? Do you think it lives up to the hype of Part 1, or is it letting you down? I managed to get how I felt about Part 2 off my chest though. As always, if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like and subscribe. Otherwise, peace.